before the covered wagon became a snow-glazed refuge in the American wilderness, a kind of Victorian igloo with wheels. It was just a glorified box on axles, a squeaky wooden box, loudly announcing its every bump with the enthusiasm of a toddler wearing bells. And yet, this humble contraption would become the great cocoon of hope for thousands of settlers caught in blizzards so fierce they might make a polar bear request a blanket. Picture this. The year is somewhere in the early to mid-1800s, and you, my drowsy companion, are nestled in a canvas-covered wagon somewhere along the Oregon Trail. Across the frozen plains, the snow is falling sideways in that bold, theatrical way it can only do when nature wants to remind humans who's really in charge. The wind howls like an unpaid opera singer outside your tiny mobile shelter. All your worldly possessions are creaking in rhythm with the wagon's joints, and you're beginning to realize that your travel arrangements may lack insulation. You're not alone. Families, single men, hopeful dreamers, and questionable gamblers all made their way west, crammed into these wooden time capsules, complete with sourdough starters and that one cousin who always got sick on travel days. The wagons were also useful for carrying such survival essentials as bacon slabs, pickled vegetables, and, because it's the 1800s, occasionally a piano. Do not ask why. One must respect the musical instincts of westward expansion. These wagons were never designed for luxury. They didn't have springs, shock absorbers, or even windows. At best, they had canvas tops stretched over wooden bows, creating the look of a long-baked bread loaf someone had accidentally hitched to a team of oxen. In the summer, they were ovens. In the spring, they were bathtubs filled with mud. And in the winter, they became something else entirely. During a snowstorm, the prairie turned blank and merciless. Tense and temporary, shelters were a joke told by the wind. So, the fragile shell of the wagon became the best, and sometimes only, place to survive. People quickly learned to wheel their homes into circles, not for conversation or square dancing ceremonies, but to break the wind, keep livestock from wandering, and to pretend teamwork would help them not freeze. Inside, people huddled together under quilts that smelled permanently of smoke and molasses. The air was thick with hope and human breath, and the windows, if you could call a slit in the canvas that, froze shut from condensation. Every night, the family would climb into the wagon bed, layering on buffalo robes, questionably knitted garments, and, when in great need, their own humility. Lying there, dogs curled at their feet, children whispering nonsense into the dark, the wind outside sharpening its teeth, they were quietly reinventing the covered wagon. It was no longer just a transport. It was a survival capsule, a semi-portable sauna. The government definitely did not regulate. Even meals had to adapt. Gone were the choreographed cooking nights around the fire. Instead, flour-dusted fingers worked inside the wagon, melting snow in tin pans to create something vaguely resembling porridge. On especially desperate nights, pancakes were made flat against the iron stove, tasting faintly of ash and optimism. It was during such storms, when wicks guttered and bacon froze solid in its grease, that the covered wagon adjusted its resume. It was now shelter, pantry, nursery, and emergency pantry again. The same vehicle that had groaned over rivers and cracked silently under mountain stars had quietly transformed into a winter lodge on wheels. Rustic, yes, 5-star, somewhere between bark and beans, but it saved lives. And so the legacy of the covered wagon is not just in how it moved people across a continent, but in how it folded itself around them when nature erased the horizon. How it became a trusted companion, against the wind's yowl and the snow's indifference. A home with no address but plenty of heart. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, get comfortable. There's much more to explore. It started with wheels and willpower, and probably some very cold feet. Imagine the morning dew resting quietly on the Kansas prairie, just before sunrise. All is still. A few birds chirp with mild optimism, as if even they aren't convinced this is a good idea. Meanwhile, around 50 humans, many of them still chamomile-scented from the dreams of Missouri, are stuffing every earthly possession they own into wooden boxes on wheels powered by oxen. Now, oxen are essentially cows who took a night class in towing, strong, stubborn, and in absolutely no rush. A suitable companion for a journey where urgency is relative and surprise blizzards hide just around every unchaperoned mountain pass. The covered wagon, known among 19th century fashionistas as the prairie schooner, was America's dependable convertible. Some were lovingly built by hand. Others were found in suspicious condition next to a barn and politely refurbished with prayer and leftover bacon grease. The famed canvas top. Waterproof canvas was expensive. So many settlers stretched cotton duck cloth, greased it with linseed oil, or just hoped the fabric didn't scream in protest when faced with 3 feet of snow. Was it drafty? Yes. Did it creak like an old man with unreliable knees? Also yes. But it was home. A mobile 1-bedroom, no bath, with a wheelbase that believed in personal boundaries and a top speed best measured in events per week. Inside this modest shelter, the average settler crammed tools, food barrels, sentimental hairbrushes, spare boots, and if you were a teenage girl, maybe a diary you wrote in dramatically, 5 lines at a time, whenever someone unjustly ate your portion of beans. Because out here, beans were currency, beans were comfort, and beans were often your only friend. It's dusk now. The sky blushes pink like it's embarrassed about how cold it's about to be. The family pulls the wagon into a tight circle with others, not for defense this time, but warmth. Think of it as a slow-motion hug made of wheels. Fires crackle, coffee boils over, and someone named Ebenezer insists that tonight surely won't freeze. Ebenezer is wrong, but no one tells him yet. The weather, that notorious improviser, drops a blizzard with the timing of a rude dinner guest. The planes go silent under powdery layers that fall faster than anyone has ever repacked their belongings. The oxen shuffle in confusion, staring at their humans as if to say, "See, told you we should have stayed in Ohio." And so, the canvas-topped wagons, which spent their days as glorified trucks, become cabins. Not elegant cabins with fireplaces, but ones where the stove is a bundle of smouldering twigs in a tin pot, and your blanket is whichever child is currently warmest. To keep the biting cold at bay, settlers barricaded wagon flaps with buffalo hides, stitched cracks with hope and twine, and snuggled as if the phrase "personal space" had been left on the East Coast. Inventiveness bloomed under these frosty ceilings. Iron skillets warmed the air briefly, despite the flurry of complaints that followed scorched boots and burned sleeves. Children took turns telling stories, some fantastical, others delightfully passive-aggressive retellings of how father couldn't find the map again. Mother may have sung softly, her voice like warm cider, dulling the howling wind into a gentle hush. Outside, snow fell without asking permission, blanketing buffalo grass and half-built dreams. Was it luxurious? No, Was it survivable? Often, just barely. And in that thin little margin between barely and not quite, the covered wagon became something of a miracle. A wooden lifeboat in a sea of snow. There's something quietly heroic about that. The way ordinary families turned lumber and cloth into a defiant cocoon, stubbornly cozy in defiance of blizzards that didn't RSVP. And so, as the pioneer huddled down, cradled by snow, courage, and cookware, you might hear the softened clatter of snowflakes tapping the top of the wagon, like tiny knocks, asking politely to come in. But nobody answers. They're wrapped tight, protected by canvas and closeness, and that sturdy optimism that only people with 500 miles and one ox-driven haircut can manage. Now, rest your thoughts a while. And picture dawn's first silver yawn as the land begins to thaw and travelers step out, boots crunching softly on yesterday's storm, ready to meet hills that don't yet know they're being crossed. Snow is a beautiful liar. It drapes the earth in a white lullaby and hushes the world into silence, like an old wool blanket thrown over the shoulders of a weary farm. But behind its twinkling charm lies a biting truth. It is cold, it is stubborn, and if you're crossing the American frontier in the mid-1800s, it does not care how desperately you miss civilization or how much pemmican you have left. By the time the wagon trains reached the high plains or the first rise of the Rockies, snow was not just a backdrop, it was a participant. 1 minute, travelers were squinting at the sun in a warm October haze, and the next, they were trying to find their oxen under 4 feet of snow and wondering if Aunt Martha had packed anything flammable besides hymnals. Enter the covered wagon. Not just a symbol of manifest destiny, but a surprisingly versatile sleep pod, storage unit, and emergency snow shelter rolled into one. Imagine a wooden wagon no longer than a small school bus, topped with a canvas cover that flapped like a moth's wing when the wind came howling over the frozen sagebrush. These wagons were the original multi-tools. They rattled across riverbeds, creaked up muddy slopes, and when the sky decided to drop 30 degrees in a single hour, they graciously transformed into miniature winter cabins, albeit without any insulation or central heating. Now, let's not romanticize the interior. Inside, it smelled vaguely of smoked bacon, unwashed wool, and existential despair. A family of 5 might huddle together like unseasoned rotisserie chickens under a single buffalo robe, while snow slithered through the seams of the canvas above. The youngest child might have to sleep curled atop a flour sack because the floorboards were occupied by a pair of particularly offended goats. Still, the covered wagon was warmer than the open prairie. It offered what pioneers valued almost above coffee: enclosure. In a world where winds could peel the bark off trees and coyotes had no respect for bedtime, being enclosed within anything, even a drafty wooden box on wheels, felt like a promise that you might just wake up in the morning. Of course, how well your wagon served as a snow shelter depended entirely on whom you had with you. Uncle Silas, for example, insisted that his wagon's canvas be waterproofed with linseed oil. It worked wonders until the fumes nearly felled the entire family halfway through Nebraska. Meanwhile, Mrs. Abernathy insisted on sewing quilts along the wagon arches for extra warmth. Her winterized design was brilliant until a sudden snowfall turned her fabric fortress into a soggy terrarium of domestic regret. Improvisation was the pioneer's constant companion. When temperatures dropped, families stuffed cracks in the floorboards with corn husks, trade receipts, and the occasional page from a devotional. Socks were worn on hands, gloves on feet, and no one dared waste candle stubs unless it was an emergency, a birthday, or they simply needed an excuse to cry. Despite the hardships, some wagons developed personalities. Or perhaps it was the families who, in their high-altitude exhaustion, began treating the wagons like members of the group. Pa's stern, "Don't lean on Betsy, she's already lopsided," could just as easily have been directed at a cousin as at the family transport. Betsy, if you're wondering, was hauled across 2 mountain passes, lost one wheel to a particularly judgmental bison, and still managed to deliver the family, half frozen, to a trading post with a single barrel of molasses and a dream. Inside these mobile homesteads, nights were passed with whispered hopes and mumbled prayers, the sounds of the wind outside mingling with the occasional domino game or a retelling of Uncle Jeremiah's rather exaggerated encounter with a hungry bear, which was in truth a raccoon with ambition. By morning, the canvas might be stiff with frost, the breath of sleepers lingering like ghosts in the chilled air. But the wagon, loyal, sagging, frostbitten creature, had carried them through the night once again, and as the sun peeked over the horizon, staining the snow with pink and gold, the weary travellers would blink their way awake, stamp the feeling back into their boots, and wonder just how far the next fort might be, and whether it served biscuits. Sometimes, on particularly adventurous mornings, they dared to believe these wagons were more than just carts. They were cocoons of hope on wheels, wrapped in canvas wings, trundling westward through the snow and into whatever came next. What did come next, however, often arrived carrying surprises of its own, like how bacon turned into currency when the snow kept everyone too frozen to fish. If you were traveling west across the American plains in the mid-1800s and had the unfortunate experience of a surprise blizzard, you might discover something quite unexpected. Your big, boxy wooden wagon, creaking, clattering, and built more like a rolling barn than a vehicle, might just transform into your overnight snowbound suite, an icebound Hilton, if you will, with fewer amenities and possibly raccoons. Frontier travelers didn't set out with the idea of their wagons becoming winter bunkers, but the prairie, as charming as it might appear from a distance, was full of personality, usually the unpleasant kind. Endless grass, unforgiving skies, temperature swings that could turn a man into a jerky strip by noon and a popsicle by nightfall. And when the clouds decided to throw a snow tantrum, there wasn't a log cabin in sight. Just you, your oxen, a biting wind, and the vehicle you suddenly started regarding with new, desperate tenderness. Covered wagons, those iconic Conestoga-style beasts we always imagine lurching across the prairie, complete with billowing canvas tops and slow-moving cattle, were never designed to be luxurious or particularly warm. They had no insulation, no heating, and, tragically, no snack bar. Yet in a pinch, they became the only refuge for people with nowhere else to go. And it turns out, all sorts of pragmatic improvisations began once travelers realized they were stuck. Don't think of it as being trapped in a wooden rectangle with cold toes. Think of it as winter glamping, 1840 style. First came the canvas, that weathered flapping top, the very thing that kept out sun and somewhat optimistically rain, was now your only defense against snow. Families would tug it down tighter, sometimes layering it with any spare cloth they had. Surely one of the earliest recorded examples of throwing a quilt on it and hoping for the best. Then, the inside. A covered wagon was technically about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. Now, if that sounds cozy, try fitting your entire family, their luggage, a couple of barrels of dry beans, and the family chicken named Gertrude into that space. Spoiler: nobody was stretching out. To keep warm, pioneers would do something both brilliant and a little terrifying under modern fire codes. They'd sometimes bring in heated rocks. Yup, after heating stones by the fire outside, when the wind allowed for anything more than a flickering suggestion of flame, they'd haul them inside and place them near their feet under blankets. This was the 19th century version of an electric blanket, minus the electricity, and with twice the potential for accidentally scorching your socks. In extreme cases, families would dig out snowdrifts around the wagons, creating a sort of half-igloo of shelter. It sounds counterintuitive, like fighting fire with flammable logs, but the insulating properties of snow actually help block the brutal prairie wind. If your wagon's wheels were frozen into place, often the case, you simply accepted that you'd be sleeping right there. No checkout policy, besides the slow spring thaw. Meals didn't stop either. Oh no, a covered wagon in a snowstorm still needed to provide sustenance, which is a romantic way of saying somebody had to figure out how to boil coffee in a blizzard. With oxen huddled up like oversized dogs outside and hands too numb to peel a potato, resourcefulness took over. They'd melt snow for water, press frozen bacon against the cast iron skillet like it owed them money, and chew slowly over tales of warmer days. Coffee was more than a drink. It was morale in liquid form. And the conversation. Let's just say snowstorms were excellent places to clear the air, or stew in silence. Depending on how one felt about being told, once again, we should have taken the southern route. Children, wrapped in every possible woolen item, were often tucked deep between barrels or huddled under piles of quilts and furs. The wagons had no beds, but with enough hay and enough imagination, a pile of scratchy blankets became a place of dreams, with the sound of snow tapping the canvas above and the distant groans of unhappy oxen giving the night a peculiar lullaby. And oddly enough, these overnight lock-ins with nature are part of what gave covered wagons their mythic place in American memory. They weren't just transport, they were resilience on four wheels. A moving home turned emergency shelter, turned storytelling nook under frosted skies. As the snow continued to fall and the stars pressed their chilly fingertips against the canvas above, families inside those wagons didn't sleep easy. But they did sleep. And sometimes, that's all that mattered. Somewhere beyond the frostbitten wheels and frozen flap, the land waited, silent and white. The fire cracked. Someone shifted under a blanket. And just as dreams began, a distant wind whispered, reminding everyone that tomorrow the road would call again. The wind was the first to arrive. Out on the vast expanse of prairie, it often came unannounced, rude, really, slipping between the boards of the wagon with a chilly curiosity, rifling through blankets, stirring embers, and testing the seams of resolve among travelers. But this was no ordinary wind. This was the kind that carried secrets of the mountains to the flatlands, whispering that winter had woken early and was already lacing up its heavy boots. The sky, once politely blue, dimmed like someone had turned the oil lamp down to mood lighting. Clouds slid in without paying the toll, thick and grey, stretching endlessly. Birds flew lower. Cows looked skeptical. Even the family dog, a shaggy, essential creature named Husker, refused to chase squirrels, which in those days was considered a sign of spiritual unrest. By midday, the first snowflakes appeared, drifting down like they were in no particular hurry. The pioneers, wrapped in wool and optimism, paused to watch. Snow, in small amounts, could be charming. It made the world feel like a quiet song and disguised the smell of damp socks. It was romantic in the unfortunate way that dysentery wasn't. But then, romance turned to reality. There's a kind of snow that dances. There's another kind that attacks. This was the latter. Wind picked up speed and began throwing tantrums across the plains, scattering tents, rattling cookware, and sending fur hats in unapproved directions. Families who only hours earlier had been arguing about axle grease now huddled together, pulling the canvas wagon cover tighter, wedging logs along the wheels to keep the wagon from rocking itself into disrepair. And just like that, the covered wagon, a bumbling box on wheels often compared to a floating barn, transformed into a life-saving cocoon. Inside, it was dim, close, and smelled like wood smoke and pickled vegetables. Quilts hung from the bows of the canvas top like homespun tapestries. Children were bundled into sleeping rolls stuffed with straw and hope. Mothers ladled out stew that clung to the spoon with desperation. Fathers listened intently to the storm outside, holding axes they sincerely hoped they wouldn't need. This wasn't their first blizzard, but it might have been their worst. The brilliance of the covered wagon was that it had all the architectural complexity of a large loaf of bread, but the portability of a wheelbarrow pulled by oxen who rarely adhered to performance standards. Yet, when the world outside became a blur of white and angles froze mid-sentence, the wagon offered something invaluable: structure, a frame, a roof, a place where you could clutch a cup of tin coffee and pretend, with a truly noble suspension of disbelief, that everything was going to be all right. The evolution of wagons from transport to temporary shelter wasn't so much innovation as it was improvisation. Most pioneers didn't plan for nights where the temperature could make an icicle out of Napoleon. But when snowbanks threatened to swallow trails whole and the wind dug its claws into every crack, no one cared that the wagon leaked or sagged or made odd creaking noises when you sneezed too hard. It was inside. That was enough. In the dark, the family whispered tales. Not heroic ones, but human ones, about grandfather's ridiculous hat, or the time the goat climbed into the flour barrel. Children giggled. The snow moaned outside like a disgruntled librarian. And somehow, tucked into their rolling shoebox with wheels, the travelers slept. It is said that hardship breeds invention, and also incredible biscuit recipes, and the notion of turning wagons into snow shelters was never entered into textbooks, partially because it never made for dashing drama. It was quiet survival. A pause between pages. Proof that history doesn't always need muskets or marches. Sometimes it just needs a canvas roof, a warm blanket, and the good sense to wait out the storm. And so, the wagons stayed put. Days passed. Snow fell with the commitment of a love letter, piling higher than some of the smaller children. But food was portioned, fires kept low, and inside each wagon, a tiny pocket of life endured. Frost clung to the canvas, glittering like powdered diamonds in the lantern light. It was, in a way, beautiful. Cold, yes, dangerously so, but also peaceful. The kind of shared stillness that doesn't get recorded in famous journals but settles into the bones of a people. Out there, halfway between nowhere and not there yet, the snow kept falling. And the wagons, antique bubbles of practical hope, held firm. And as the storm would begin to loosen its grip, just slightly, the settlers would soon face another forgotten trial. What happened after? The snow, when everything melted and turned entirely into mud. The snow had arrived early that year, like an unexpected relative at your doorstep with a suitcase and a suspiciously hearty appetite. October wasn't supposed to look like January, but on the high plains of what would one day be Wyoming, the weather preferred surprises over calendars. Out on the trail, Covered wagons moved at the speed of tired oxen and aching knees. The pioneers, those patient, plodding optimists of the 19th century, had developed a sixth sense. When a storm started whispering across the grasslands, they could feel it in their elbows. Some said the wind told stories. Others said it just grumbled a lot. Either way, it spoke, and smart folks listened. As snow began to drift over the prairie grass, the wagons pulled into tighter formations. This was not just for proximity. It was strategy. Think of it as early American climate-controlled parking. The wagon canvas, that iconic white arching top, was more than decoration. It was shelter. And when the wind howled and the temperatures believed in extremes, families didn't just ride in the wagons, they slept in them. But before we climb into one of those cozy wood and canvas boxes, let's pause for the uninitiated. A covered wagon was, in essence, a wooden cart with glorified bedsheets stretched over it. The official term was Conestoga wagon, or sometimes prairie schooner, because it floated across the tall grass like a ship across a sea, albeit with fewer pirates and more flatulence from livestock. Inside was a barley-scented jigsaw of household goods: feather beds, cast iron pots, winter coats, pickles in jars, and invariably one unpredictable toddler. There were no windows, save for the front flap. And insulation? Only the combined breath of a family of 6 and the smell of beans. Now, during average weather, wagons were not where people usually slept. Most folks preferred their tents, their bedrolls, or a brief yet adventurous nap under the stars, possibly interrupted by a curious raccoon. But in a snowstorm, suddenly, that little space on the wagon floor, wedged between sacks of flour and Aunt Mildred's favorite chamber pot, became prime real estate. Climbing into a covered wagon during a blizzard was equal parts choreography and resignation. First, you'd barricade the opening with some kind of curtain or blanket. Then, everyone tucked in like mismatched spoons in a drawer. Parents on one side, children layered on top of each other like rogue lasagna, and maybe a chicken tucked somewhere near someone's boots for warmth and breakfast optimism. At night, the snowfall thudded quietly on the canvas above, like a polite drummer with no audience. Winds whipped the prairie grasses into ghostly dances, while families cocooned themselves in quilts patched with memories from places left behind. The air grew warm with shared breath, whispered stories, and the soft sniffles of noses processing pioneer pollen and cabin fever. One mother, writing in her diary in 1854, noted that she and her 5 children, plus all worldly possessions, managed to sleep full and hearty in the wagon during a most vicious frost. Translation: no one lost a toe, and the goat stayed outside. Of course, doesn't this make you wonder, how did they cook? Well, sometimes not at all. When snow piled higher than firewood stacks, meals became an adventure in chewing slowly. Cold beans, cold cornbread, ice-flecked bacon that shattered like heartbreak. But inside the wagon, they huddled, told stories, and sometimes sang. Not because they were cheerful, necessarily, but because the rhythm of song kept the shivering manageable and the wolves guessing. Wagon wheels, meanwhile, froze in place. The axles stiffened like brittle knees. The oxen stood nearby, heavily blanketed under makeshift burlap cloaks, wondering why they had agreed to this in the first place. But the covered wagon had done its job. Against wild winds and prairie cold, it became not just transportation, but transformation. A home, a haven, a snug little cocoon made of wood, canvas, and sheer pioneer stubbornness. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival with a frontier flair. And nestled within those snowy nights, warmed by breath and borrowed courage, families learned that anywhere could be home, so long as hope and a good deal of hay were involved. Far out on the plains, morning sometimes crept in slowly, stretching pink fingers across snowdrifts and icing the canvas wagons in soft frost. Inside, the first cough or yawn would signal another day of slow galloping westward. But before they moved on, before boots were laced and bacon was gnashed through chattering teeth, there were still moments of stillness. Moments when frozen breath hung in the air like question marks, and it was always then. A pause between night and motion, when something else would stir besides the wind. As dusk slipped its violet shawl across the plains and the prairie winds hushed their roaring to a whisper, a curious transformation would begin among the westward-bound pioneers. Wagons, those creaky, canvas-covered companions of daytime travel, grew still, their stingy wheels settling into the frost-crusted soil like heavy old men, setting their backs against the tavern wall. But on particularly bitter nights, when snow began, its silent blitzkrieg and the cold coiled around wagons like a patient serpent, the humble covered wagon would become something altogether different. A snug, makeshift night shelter. Now, it wasn't that these wagons were designed for winter hospitality. Let's be honest, they weren't exactly the penthouse suite at the Prairie Hilton. Spanning about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, your average covered wagon had just enough room for a family to lie down crosswise if they kept their elbows tucked and held personal grudges about who had the smelliest feet. Still, when a snowstorm rose with that eerie silence that only blizzards know, the wagon became the last, best hope of not freezing into the kind of cautionary tale small towns whispered about. Inside, warmth was a matter of strategy and stubbornness. First came the bedding, a patchwork assortment of wool blankets, scratchy quilts stitched in Ohio parlors, and sometimes buffalo hides traded for when luck favored the bold and somewhat foolish. Next came the bodies. Everyone climbed in. Children, parents, sometimes neighbors, and often at least one dog who was entirely unapologetic about taking up the warmest spot. The canvas covering, called the bonnet, which may call to mind sunny meadows, but was in fact more about trapping body heat than a fashion sense, served as the only roof. It rattled when the wind snapped at it, and it let air in places it shouldn't have. But when reinforced with tarpaulin or woolen linings, it could hold enough warmth to keep frostbite away from the toes, just barely. Pioneers got quite creative. Some would string lanterns inside the wagon body, carefully balancing them to avoid burning down their only home. The heat from one lantern could warm the whole space by a few degrees, just enough to edge the climate from Arctic tundra to mediocre root cellar. Others would heat rocks in the daytime fire and place them under blankets before sleep. A rustic version of a hot water bottle, though it did lack the charm of not burning your shin while you dozed. And then there was the food, because of course, warmth isn't just about wool and body heat. It's about hot mush, or biscuits, or anything that could be boiled with the weakest flame and shared among stiff, mittened fingers. One popular choice was slapjacks, essentially pancakes with delusions of grandeur. When cooked over a tiny fire ringed with stones to protect it from the wind, these could be folded like warm envelopes of hope and optimism and shoved directly into awaiting mouths. The community aspect was also no small comfort. Families traveling together would often form a circle with their wagons, the iconic wagon train corral shape. This wasn't just cinematic. It helped block wind and created a slightly warmer microclimate in the center. Plus, it made it easier for folks to exchange stories, boil beans, or shout moral support when someone sneezed so hard they fell off their wagon step. Even the exteriors of covered wagons took on extra purpose in winter. Some folks hung blankets or buffalo hides over the outside of the canvas cover to insulate their little house on wheels. Others banked snow up around the wagon base, unintentionally recreating a sort of prairie igloo effect. Snow is surprisingly a pretty good insulator when it's not actively trying to bury your roof. And in the dead of night, when all you could hear was the gentle clink of ice shifting in branches, or the slow snore of a trail companion dreaming of warmer grasslands, the covered wagon gave off its own kind of quiet strength, a tiny ark of survival bobbing gently in history's blizzard. Not bad for a glorified farm cart held together by wooden pegs and the occasional prayer. As the fire dwindles and the wind curls like a cat around the wheels, our travellers, wrapped in quilts, dreams, and a light dusting of snow, carry on ever westward toward horizons both wild and wonderfully unforgiving. But next, well, what do you suppose happens when too much snow meets too little patience? As winter whispered its arrival across the open prairie, the sky took on that bleak, bone-white hue, like it was sighing one immense chilly yawn. Winds swept low over the grasslands, and snowflakes, not the delicate, artistic sort that poets go on about, but rather the aggressive, sideways flying kind, began to gather their strength. For wagon trains rolling westward in the 1840s and 50s, this wasn't just a nuisance. It was a knobbly-knuckled knock on the door from Mother Nature herself, and she was less of a nurturing figure and more of a strict aunt who thought you ought to learn lessons the frosty, uncomfortable way. Most emigrants, bless their shivering hearts, were well aware that crossing the Rockies too late in the year was like trying to bake bread in a blizzard. Ambitious, but unwise. Still, delays happened. Oxen got cranky, rivers flooded. Little Timmy decided he absolutely had to rescue a turtle, and that set the whole caravan back by a day and a half. Before long, they'd find themselves just east of the mountain passes, turning up their collars against the kind of wind that made stew feel inadequate. And so, the humble covered wagon, previously just a creaky box on wheels plagued by axle woes and the occasional suspicious wheel squeak, had to step into a new role, the prairie equivalent of a survivalist condo. These wagons, already modest in design, were nothing more than wooden carts shielded by a canvas cloth often greased with linseed oil, a substance that smelled like varnish peas, but offered some resistance against precipitation. In fair weather, they served as mobile bedrooms, storage bins, and on particularly determined days, birthing rooms. But when snow began icing the horses' eyelashes and the landscape transformed into a white nothingness, families had to reinvent the wheel, or at least what was above it. Now, here's the thing about canvas. It is not a natural source of warmth. In fact, it does about as good a job at insulation as a wet sock. To remedy this, pioneers employed layers, quilts, buffalo hides, blankets sewn with more hope than skill, and every member of the family essentially mummified themselves into their shared bed space. Husbands, wives, toddlers, and the dog, all crammed in there like 19th century nesting dolls, breathing in potatoes and each other. And let's not forget the hot bricks. Before turning in for the night, one would heat bricks by the fire and stuff them under covers to radiate a small bubble of warmth. If you were lucky, it made the space cozy. If you weren't, you woke up spooning a brick with third-degree thigh burns. Food was another hurdle. In these makeshift igloos on wheels, pioneers would cook right inside the wagon if the wind outside screamed too loudly. They used small stovepipes poked through the canvas, assuming they had the parts and the good fortune not to set their entire rolling home aflame. Beans, salt pork, and hardtack were the go-to menu items, dishes that required minimal fuss and came with the bonus feature of being edible in all weather conditions, if your standards were forgiving. At night, the wind would whistle through tiny gaps in the wood, carrying with it stories of distant coyotes and the occasional alarming creak from an especially heavy snowdrift above. And yet, wrapped in layers of wool and familial proximity, there was a strange peace. The world outside had gone white and silent, and within the wagon, flatulence aside, there was warmth, breath, and the soft murmur of shared survival. It wasn't quite glamorous. You can imagine little Mary sighing at the smell of Uncle Nathan's feet, slowly marinating beside their baked bean dinner. But it was home, for now. And in that snug little capsule on wheels, parked below stars no one could see, the pioneers managed to outsleep the storm. Come, morning. If the snow hadn't buried the wheels entirely, it was time to dig out, melt snow for coffee that tasted suspiciously like leather, and figure out whether forward still meant progress, or a poetic tragedy in the making. And while the wind may have calmed for the moment, a new challenge always liked to hide behind melted snowbanks and optimistic plans. Up ahead, far too quiet and quietly far, rose the ever-patient shimmering wall of the Sierra Nevada, waiting to see who might greet it next. It turns out, the phrase "snowed in" really hits differently when you're a pioneer somewhere in the Rockies. Your oxen have wandered off, and the only reliable insulation is a quilt stitched by someone named Hester back in Ohio. The westward-bound pioneers had many things: hope, grit, an astonishing quantity of biscuit flour. But they did not have central heating. So when winter came down like an overripe pumpkin off a roof, sudden, heavy, and slightly alarming, the covered wagon became less of a transportation device and more of a life-size survival sock. It wasn't Plan A. It wasn't even really Plan B. In most travelers' minds, the covered wagon was supposed to roll steadily onward toward Oregon, like a hopeful pastry down a gently sloping table. But snowstorms, particularly surprise ones, have never paid attention to neatly penciled travel plans. Now imagine, it's late October. The sun has been playing hide and seek behind gathering clouds, and the last of the red-gold leaves are spiraling, confused and panicked, to the frozen trail. Your horses have started sighing with alarming frequency. Birds are flying south in curt little V's, and the wind has the personality of someone who's just been left at the altar. You know what's coming. The first sign is always silence. Not the peaceful silence of a dewy pastoral morning, but the uncanny, wool-muffled quiet that precedes heavy snow. It starts slow, little flutters, like sky dandruff. Then, before you've finished unwrapping your jerky, everything is white. Your boots vanish beneath a crunchy crust. Time itself seems to slow down, lazily burying the landscape under drifts of powdered inconvenience. In this moment of cinematic dread, the practical pioneers began to eye their wagons not as seats of transport, but as possible cabins on wheels. The canvas cover, originally designed to keep out sun, dust, and unwelcome prairie chickens, suddenly transformed into a cocoon. Wagons were sturdier than they looked, especially when you considered that many modern tents are somehow designed to be both waterproof and not waterproof at the same time. Inside a covered wagon, things got cozy, albeit In the rugged, slightly smelly way one might describe a well-loved pair of woolen socks, the typical sleeping position was together, very together. Family members slept in a kind of human lasagna, layered, tightly packed, limbs crossed over bodies like oddly hopeful spaghetti. Younger children typically slept in cubby-like spaces beneath storage crates, which was a little like being a very cold present. To keep warm, pioneers deployed every heat-gathering strategy known to 19th century ingenuity. Heated rocks were pulled from fires and wrapped in thick cloth, then placed inside bedding to mimic the effect of a very sleepy radiator. Some pioneers even saved chicken feathers for insulation, not exactly as effective as modern Thinsulate, but fluffier. Food, too, took a dramatic seasonal shift during snowbound episodes. Gone were the days of leisurely griddle cakes. Now it was all stews, dried meat, and bean concoctions that doubled as meals and central heating. Water often needed to be melted over coals, and cooking indoors meant that wagons sometimes ended up smelling like a lightly grilled root cellar. But warmth was only part of the job. Spirits had to be lifted. Enter storytelling, hymns, and that timeless classic, the harmonica. Many a snowed-in night was passed listening to creaky renditions of "Oh Susanna," while someone in the corner tried to remember if they had packed any extra socks, or just 6 pounds of lard. Of course, not all wagons were winterproof, and many were hastily reinforced with whatever could be scrounged from the landscape: pine boughs, buffalo hides, an ill-fated picnic table from earlier that autumn. Ingenuity turned necessities into insulation, as wagon dwellers became accidental architects of the great American snow fort. It wasn't glamorous, but then neither was manifest destiny. These moments of cold camaraderie, bundled up beneath a gently dripping canvas, were the crucibles where the pioneer spirit was warmed, fed, and gently thawed. And while the wind howled past the wagon wheels and the snow continued its slow descent into legend, the travelers huddled close, knowing that somehow, through a combination of soup and stubbornness, they'd make it. Somewhere beyond the storm, spring waited, chuckling behind a curtain. But before the thaw, there would be one more test of the humble wagon's enduring utility. By the time snow started to fall in earnest on the high plains, life in a covered wagon had turned into a peculiar mix of pioneer grit and early American indoor camping. It was November grey. Winds were whispering secrets through the cracks in canvas, and families were beginning to turn their rolling homes into stay-put shelters. The prairie no longer rolled under wheels. It simply sat, white and hushed, pretending to be a field of sugar. The horses pretended they didn't mind. But deep down, just like the people pulling up canvas flaps and cinching things tight, they were thinking, well, this is going to get weird. A covered wagon wasn't originally meant to be a winter chalet. It was a vehicle with a dairy cart's physique and the dreams of a small sailboat, designed primarily for forward motion and not seasonal hibernation. Yet when a sudden storm pressed down like a well-meaning but over-enthusiastic aunt's hug, pioneers had little choice but to anchor their Conestogas where they stood, and then, quite heroically, some might say questionably, they tried to make them livable. Inside the wagon, life turned into a sort of horizontal puzzle. The floor was not much wider than a twin mattress, a fact that became painfully clear when 5 or 6 family members tried to lie down without bumping into each other, or the cast iron skillet precariously perched on the footlocker. There was a particular knack to staying warm without melting your only pair of wool socks. Most families brought along a small tin stove, charmingly named the Prairie Stove, a miracle of frontier engineering that could burn buffalo chips, dried sagebrush, or anything else that had once known the sun. These stoves were about the size of a mailbox and nearly as temperamental. Lighting one involved a combination of prayer, flint, and not breathing too hard. Once going, though, the stove became the sacred heart of the cabin on wheels. Women would hang blankets from the wagon bows to trap the heat, creating something halfway between a tent and a hot air balloon in training. Draped in quilts with faces poking out like potatoes on resting racks, families huddled for warmth, drank tepid sassafras tea, and tried not to bump their heads on the crossbeam. Imagine 6 people trying to nap inside a baked potato, and you're about halfway there. Snowstorms out west weren't flurries, they were declarations. They showed up with the confidence of a parade and the subtlety of a brass band. Whiteout conditions could arrive within minutes, and temperatures dropped faster than optimism at a barn raising interrupted by outlaw raids. For pioneers who'd been educated by the school of experience, the wisdom was simple. If the storm came, the wagon stayed. Outside, the canvas top would quickly turn into a domed igloo, heavy with snow and creaking under its weight. More seasoned travelers would prop the supports with extra beams, while the less prepared would listen nervously as their covers sagged a bit more with each sigh of wind. Children were often forbidden from asking, "Is it going to collapse?" Not because it wasn't a good question, but because the adults really didn't want to think about it. One particularly ingenious, or perhaps desperate solution, was to insulate the inside of the wagon with items not typically found on the walls of a stagecoach: buffalo robes, strips of bark, newspapers glued with Auntie Mabel's molasses paste, and in one recorded case, 3 layers of wallpaper stolen from an abandoned way station. That wagon, it was said, had a parlor feel, even if it shook in the wind like a card table in a strong draft. Meals inside the converted wagon took on a steamy stovetop intimacy. Cornmeal mush, dried apple pudding, and what can only be generously called soup, a mysterious blend of salt pork, beans, and whatever had not yet grown fuzzy, became evening rituals. By some miracle, pioneer mothers could produce passable biscuits in pans no wider than a straw hat, all while keeping little ones from stepping into the firebox. Sleep, when it came, was a complex choreography of elbows, snoring, and moral negotiations. Who got to sleep nearest the stove? Who had to sleep by the flaps? Could 2 people share one blanket without descending into sibling sabotage? Yet, for all its flaws, the covered wagon in winter became something quietly heroic. It was ingenuity bent around a hickory frame, a symbol of stubborn survival. Even with wheels frozen and wind howling like lonely cattle, it was home for a spell, a strangely comforting, lumpy, creaky home. And as the snow whispered against the canvas and the stars sneaked brief peeks through broken clouds, the people inside dreamed not of warm parlours back east, but of simply seeing spring again. Of course, with every passing day, surviving began to require more than quilts and kettle skills. It required choices, some clever, some utterly questionable, and sometimes they came across things buried beneath the snow, things that made them wonder what other secrets the trail was holding close. As the wagon trains trudged deeper into the wild unknown, they carried a curious cargo, not gold, not furs, not even contraband cheese, but hopes with canvas tops, dreams with wooden wheels, and an almost cartoonish disregard for the idea of seasonal timing. Some families set out west as though they'd just checked the farmer's almanac and said, "Well, snow's in 3 weeks. Better get started." By late autumn, the plains began to shift from golden grasslands to icy whispers of the chill looming ahead. The sky took on the color of cold pewter. Birds started flying in the opposite direction, as if to say, "You're going where?" Among the many indispensable accoutrements strapped to the covered wagon, barrels, pots, Granny's jam jar collection, and various precursors to what we now call junk, was an underappreciated hero, the canvas bonnet, draped over sturdy wooden bows. Built to keep sun and rain off the travelers, it would soon become, quite accidentally, a savior in the snow. Now, imagine you're a pioneer. You've been walking next to your oxen for the better part of 8 hours, wearing a hat stitched by someone who only had 6 fingers and awkward opinions about symmetry. The sun dipped beneath a jagged edge of mountain, and now the wind is flirting aggressively with your earlobes. You're cold, you're tired, and someone just burned the last of the salted pork trying to cook it over a controlled fire that got disturbingly ambitious. So what did settlers do when the weather began its shift from brisk to Santa Claus's revenge? They climbed into the covered wagon for the night. Yes, that bumpy wooden rectangle on wheels, lined with barrels of flour and the occasional stowaway chicken, transformed into a make-do shelter, something between a bedroom and a very claustrophobic shed. Inside, the canvas caught the remaining warmth from recently extinguished cooking fires. Once the flaps were tied down, the space offered a sort of human-sized thermos effect. It was not the Ritz-Carlton, but compared to sleeping outside in the high-pitched shriek of a Wyoming snow squall, it was practically a geothermal spa. The wagon interior was cleverly arranged. Bedding was rolled out. Buffalo robes, quilts, and anything flammable that wasn't nailed down. Children nestled against parents. Old uncles with creaky knees were tucked against flour sacks for insulation, both practical and faintly symbolic. Dogs curled at anyone's feet who'd let them, and all of them fell asleep to the lullaby of the wind howling like a ghost who disapproved of your travel itinerary. You might be wondering, wouldn't the snow get in anyway? Well, yes and no. Early on, the canvas tops would sag a bit under the weight of fresh snow. But soon, someone realized that this very sag could be turned into an advantage. A good layer of snow atop the canvas acted like a natural insulator. In other words, once the wagon got thoroughly snowed on, it stayed warmer. Just don't poke at it too much unless you wanted a powdered sugar blast right in your sternum. Of course, weatherproofing back then wasn't exactly NASA engineered. Some families used bear grease for the canvas, for leather, and occasionally for cooking, shoe shining, or taming eyebrows. Waxy residue might help keep moisture out, but it also brought curious wildlife a little too close. There are a handful of unconfirmed accounts describing discomforting meetings with raccoons that mistook a greased canvas panel for a midnight snack. And while the canvas did shield many from the worst of freezing wind, there was one subtle hazard no one truly warned them about: condensation. Trapped inside the wagon, body heat met freezing outer air and created little droplets of icy disapproval that occasionally dripped back onto the settlers' foreheads in the small hours of the night. It was like being kissed by a very judgmental cloud. Still, despite the discomforts, the cramped quarters, the nose-numbing cold, and the general sense that one's life now belonged to the whims of weather and wheels, there was a peculiar charm to these covered wagon night shelters. In the flickering warmth of a single candle, a family could huddle close, whisper stories, count stars through canvas seams, or play a dangerously competitive game of who has the warmest feet. And so, in near silence, Save for the creaking wood and trembling winds, the settlers slept, weary, chilled, but oddly comforted by the sturdy hill of snow that had tucked itself like a blanket over the vehicle of their dreams. Somewhere outside, the coyotes sang their lullaby, part warning, part poetry, to mark the end of one day's push westward. The wagons waited like softly breathing beasts, ready to wake at dawn, when the snow would gleam pink and gold. And just beyond the frosted canvas, a new problem was brewing. One involving chimneys that didn't exist, and how exactly one vents a fire inside a wooden wagon without waking up in the next life. As winter's breath swept across the high plains, the Oregon Trail transformed from a dusty ribbon of dreams into a frostbitten test of metal. And mittens, if you were lucky enough to have two. For pioneers making their way westward, it wasn't uncommon to wake up with frost on their eyelashes inside their wagon. Romantic, perhaps, if you're a snowflake. Less so if you're trying to unfreeze your boots with your armpits. Somewhere near the edge of what is now Wyoming, the snow didn't just fall. It settled in. Lounged, really. Like a house guest who misses all the social cues but eats all your pemmican anyway. The storms would roll across the landscape like a thick white curtain. Drawing closed the theatre of progress. Visibility dropped. Temperatures plummeted. Tempers occasionally flared unless, of course, your lips were frozen shut. That's when the covered wagon, the Conestoga cousin of the prairie, revealed a secret not found in most travel brochures. It doubled, in the direst of times, as a snug, makeshift cabin. Not a deluxe suite, mind you, but sturdy and dryish, like camping with a touch of hardship and a whisper of hypothermia. Of course, the standard wagon's setup wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to carry barrels of flour, unpredictable livestock, thunderous children, and perhaps a piano, if someone in the family had both bad judgment and great upper body strength. Sleeping inside it was less glamping and more please don't die in the snow. But when the blizzards danced and darkness unrolled like a cold carpet, families crawled inside their wagons, side by side, boot to bonnet, sibling to sibling, all sharing breath and body heat like pioneer penguins. Buffalo hides were thrown over the canvas top for insulation. A kind of 19th century cozy upgrade package. Others stitched quilts into the outer seams, the original thermal lining, decades before the down jacket would swish into existence. Inside, the routine of survival took on a bedtime hush. A tin lantern flickered, casting sleepy shadows over the wooden boughs of the canvas cover. Soft talk swirled, prayers, gentle reassurances, a few too loud snores from Uncle Hiram, who apparently could rattle both coyotes and nerves. Snowstorm slumber in a wagon meant sizzling breath against freezing winds. The sides of the canvas glazed with frost by morning, and boots had to be cuddled like treasures lest they turned into foot-shaped ice sculptures overnight. Sometimes, fathers would line the floor with fir branches or buffalo grass to keep sleeping bodies from resting directly on the cold planks. Mothers, with their nearly magical toughness, brewed chamomile from wild plants when they could find them, wrapping children in shawls woven from patience and perseverance. Ironically, while outside the wagons winter could be cruel and still, inside these rolling fortresses, nightly life buzzed in quiet resilience. People told stories, some true, many not, and the best falling somewhere in between, warmed by imagination. Children drifted to sleep to the sound of muffled snowflakes against canvas, and mothers humming ghosted lullabies passed down from other winters long ago. Not all tales ended softly. Frostbite was no bedtime myth. and some wagons bore loss along with lanterns. But nearly as strong as the cold was the current of care that pulsed through these tiny microcosms on wheels. Snug as they were, covered wagons became more than transportation. They became cradles of courage, cocoons of grit, little arcs bobbing in a sea of snow. And somewhere, amid the drifting silence, a child would often whisper, "Will the sun ever come again?" And someone wiser, or at least pretending to be, would reply, "Of course, it's just off chasing buffalo." As a flock of wagons huddled close together like geese in a gale, the snowstorm hushed the land. Nothing stirred beyond the canvas walls. The prairie slumbered under a white quilt. Wagons creaked gently in the wind, dreaming perhaps of greener valleys ahead, or simply hoping the chili hadn't frozen again. And far beyond that frostbitten horizon, something, or someone, was already inventing a new solution to cold. A puff of smoke, a clank of iron, a stove on wheels. But that, of course, was a tale of hot tempers, metal parts, and the quiet rise of one rather smoky salvation. There's a strange, charming magic in how humans, when faced with life-threatening cold, dwindling rations, and an approaching blizzard, can still find time to argue about socks. It was late December, somewhere near South Pass, Wyoming territory, which, in the 1840s, was known less for its hospitality and more for its generous distribution of frostbite. A string of covered wagons, huddled together like a row of tired geese, had just weathered 2 nights of snow and Wyoming wind, which is to say, they had survived an argument with a very large, very angry ghost buffalo. The snow had come down sideways, as if gravity had lost interest in the usual arrangement. Grass vanished, trail markers disappeared. Even the oxen, usually unbothered by meteorological hissy fits, started looking longingly at the warm bellies of the horses. Inside one of the wagons, canvas flapping with each gust, a family of 5 had engineered what might generously be described as a thermal democracy. Every body lay head to foot to head, nested like spoons in a drawer, under every piece of fabric not currently nailed to the wagon sides. Quilts, shawls, and shamefully aromatic beaver pelts they'd traded for in Missouri were all pressed into service. At night, the gentle tapping of frozen sleet on the canvas roof joined the chorus of snores, the occasional cough, and the distant whimper of a man who had made the mistake of eating snow with questionable enthusiasm. The covered wagon, it turned out, was made not just for movement, but for stopping. In winter, the prairie could flatten your hopes in moments, so the pioneers adapted. They turned their wagons into little survival pods. The term cozy might be a stretch, but if you'd like to imagine the Beckham family in the corner wagon hammering a fire grate to one end of the wagon bed so they could roast turnips inside, then please do. Reality was cold, dreams were not. And these wagons, they weren't just shelters. They were bakeries, schools, infirmaries, confessionals, and the stage for every melodramatic family disagreement you've ever heard. Which brings us, quite naturally, back to the socks. Hiram, eldest son of the wonderfully named Jezebel and Thaddeus Knapp, had declared his right to the last dry socks sometime around supper, consisting of boiled flour dredged in salt, if you could find it. Lurleen, his younger sister and full-time enforcer of fairness, had other ideas. A sock tribunal was conducted. Testimonies were made, including a spirited argument from an aunt wedged behind a barrel of bacon. It was eventually decided that Hiram would wear each sock for 2-hour intervals before rotating them to Lurleen, and that no one else should be allowed to sniff them without written permission. This, apparently, was frontier justice. Outside the wagons, the world hardened into crusty layers of shimmering snow. The buttes, wrapped in silence, glowed blue-grey in the starlight. Horses hunched together under feed blankets, and the wind settled into its only mood, suspiciously spiteful. But inside, the wagons adjusted. The canvas, roofs, if reinforced with oilcloth or, better yet, discarded tarpaulins from less lucky travellers, held surprisingly firm. Snow piled high against the sides, insulating the lower walls. Iron stoves, carefully shielded and fed with pinched twigs and dried buffalo droppings, glowed like sleepy volcanoes. Children fell asleep listening to stories about woolly mammoths turning into hills, and hills turning into mountains, and someone's great-uncle Alfred, who once wrestled a goose during a snowstorm and declared it an angel. There was no plumbing, and privacy was a matter of imaginative angles. But survival had a kind of rhythm. The wagons nudged closer. Quilts were stitched by candlelight. Socks migrated from foot to foot in according to a carefully maintained sibling treaty. And from time to time, someone played a fiddle so softly it seemed like a memory more than a melody. The prairie, so vast and indifferent by day, became an accidental cocoon by night, a swirl of snow and starlight, a people made warm by stubbornness and resourcefulness, and the noble belief that maybe, just maybe, there'd be a thaw before breakfast. And as the snow deepened and the stoves flickered, another sound surfaced, the gentle thud of someone else slipping into another wagon. After all, the next part of the storm was coming, and the closer the wagons huddled, the better stories they would share to make it through. By late autumn, the Oregon Trail resembled less a bustling route of ambition and more an unsupervised game of survival charades. The wagons no longer trundled with rhythmic confidence, but instead huddled alongside creeks and in the lee of hills, cloaked by snowdrifts and silence. With biting winds and frostbitten fingertips, pioneers learned a lesson as old as mammoths. When nature frowns, it does not do so halfway. Among the most popular, if reluctant, adaptations to this frosty ordeal was the transformation of the humble covered wagon into a snug, if aromatic, winter refuge. You see, a covered wagon wasn't simply a mode of transport. It was also your pantry, your bedroom, your panic room, and occasionally served as your stage for dramatic recitations of "How much longer, dear God?" Sheltering inside a wagon during a blizzard was simultaneously the best idea, and perhaps the most aromatic one. Picture the average wagon. It's about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, roughly the same interior space as a modern elevator, but with significantly more pickled beans. Inside, privacy was a philosophical concept, not a practical one. Families of 5 to 8 might squeeze together like spoons in a drawer, bundled beneath buffalo robes, itchy wool blankets, and the occasional confused toddler. Every available surface became a mattress, and naturally, someone always snored like a haunted accordion. The canvas top, held up by wooden bows, wouldn't stop a determined raindrop, let alone horizontal snow, but desperate ingenuity took over. Pioneers stitched extra hides to their wagon covers, stuffed crevices with spare clothing, and hung quilts like medieval tapestries of domestic despair. Some travelers even placed hot coals in pots under their wagons for warmth, resulting in about 1/3 comfort and 2/3 collective fear that the wagon would go up in flames. Livestock, now too valuable to simply stand around shivering, might be tied close to the wagon for shared warmth, a decision that blessed households with both radiant heat and eau de mule in the same breath. Of course, the decision to ride out a snowstorm inside the wagon came only after robust denial. At first, most tried to press on, trusting, against all odds and logic, that the wind might be bluffing. It rarely was. Snow-blinded travelers obscured trails and transformed the world into a cruel, white forget-me-not. When the storm would not relent, the wagons pulled into half-moon formations, not just for camaraderie, but wind resistance, faces wrapped in scarves. Men and women chopped limbs from nearby trees, stacking the pieces in hopeful heaps that would later behave exactly the opposite of dry firewood. Evening fell thick and fast, the snow-muffled sound creating a frozen hush that was both peaceful and deeply unsettling, not unlike being alone in a library with a bear. Inside the wagons, oil lanterns flickered with a soft golden glow. Shadows danced on the canvas, giving the illusion of movement where none existed. Children, red-nosed and wide-eyed, listened to stories they've already heard a dozen times. Tales about warm kitchens and apple pie, about spring and washing your face in a creek without it turning to glass 6 inches from your nose. A father might carve a toy from firewood splinters. A mother hummed to herself while knitting socks she secretly resented. Night in the wagon wasn't so much a restful interlude as a crowded negotiation of limbs. Someone always had sharp elbows, someone else a nocturnally ambitious bladder. Parents became experts at muffled shushing, lest noises attract predators, wolves, bears, or worse, other shivering families in jealous search of cozier wagons. Oddly, the confinement also bred the tiniest seeds of comfort. There was something oddly democratic about sharing a 40-square-foot cocoon with people you knew would tell you tomorrow that you rolled over on their face. Resilience wore knitted slippers and carried a ladle. You might not sleep, but you'd be warmed by the sense of survival. And, let's be honest, the armpit of your cousin Hannah. And then, as the wind softened its tantrum and the first blue slivers of dawn cracked through the frost-caked canvas, someone would poke their head out, eyelashes sparkling with ice. Silence. Stillness. The storm had passed, but the trail ahead had not. And with the snow behind them and the Rocky Mountains ahead, the covered wagons would creak, groan, and grudgingly get moving again, as if they'd just woken from a bizarre buffalo-scented nap and remembered they still had 800 miles to go. Give or take. By the time December curled its frostbitten fingers around the wagons, the plains had shed every trace of autumn and replaced their golden grasses with knee-deep snowdrifts, white, soft, and unforgiving. The prairie had a way of turning beautiful things into life-threatening events with very little warning. And while nature was performing this silent trick, the settlers were performing one of their own. The humble metamorphosis of the covered wagon into something akin to a portable, if slightly drafty, alpine chalet. You see, the covered wagon was never designed with luxury in mind. There was no spa, no heated mattress, and not a single throw pillow that didn't smell vaguely like salted pork and canvas. But inside those creaky wooden frames, miracles of human ingenuity and brute discomfort took place nightly, especially during snowstorms. Picture it. Outside, the wind screamed across the plains with the fury of 1,000 unpaid banshees. Inside, a family of 6 huddled shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, in a space roughly the size of your average modern walk-in closet. There was method, if not elegance, to their arrangement. The heaviest blankets, often known as buffalo robes, which were less blanket and more full-size buffalo, were spread across laps and heads. Children were tucked beneath benches. Mothers slept half upright, with their babies zipped into makeshift sling coats. Fathers stood guard at the wagon flap, looking brave while subtly reconsidering every life decision that had led them to this frosty tundra of regrets. The canvas that covered the wagon, tightly wound and coated in linseed oil, was more weather-resistant than you might expect. It didn't exactly laugh in the face of snow, but it did sigh heavily and hold its shape. Layers of canvas, if treated well, could keep out much of the wind and some of the cold, though by some, we do mean poetically tiny portions. It was like trying to fend off a charging bear with a dinner napkin. Admirable effort, dubious results. But settlers had tricks. They'd pile snow along the bottom edges of the wagon to insulate it, unintentionally inventing the first frontier-grade glamping sealant. Fires couldn't be used inside the wagon, of course, unless someone was feeling particularly adventurous and not especially attached to oxygen. So warmth came from proximity and potatoes. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to boil potatoes before bed, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them into sleeping pallets like toasty little tuber-foot warmers. By morning, the potatoes would be cold, but so would everything else, except emotions. Those ran pretty hot when you hadn't had toast in 3 months. And the snow. Oh, the snow was both nemesis and neighbor. As long as you didn't panic about its tendency to trap you for days, it did offer a peculiar quiet, like someone hit the mute button on the planet. That snowy silence was broken only by the occasional creak of a wooden wheel adjusting to the cold, or someone mumbling urgently in their sleep about forgetting the dried beans. Some families swore the worst part wasn't the cold at all, but the smell. You see, when livestock were sheltered nearby, or even tethered close to the wagons for warmth, the combined olfactory atmosphere was memorable. Imagine a blend of wet wool, onion sweat, and horse enthusiasm. You really didn't need an alarm clock. The breeze at dawn, wafting gently through the canvas flaps, carried with it the scent of all your choices. Still, despite frostbitten toes and schnitzel-scented air, there was an odd kind of tenderness inside these makeshift snowbound shelters. Voices were quieter, laughter slower and more precious. A penny whistle might be played if someone's fingers weren't too stiff with cold. Twine games were passed between numb hands. Stories were told, always a favorite pastime. And no matter how bleak the circumstances, those stories had a way of traveling toward hope, even if heavily wrapped in exaggeration and the occasional mistranslation of facts. There were no thermostats, no bunk beds, no marshmallows for your hot drink. There wasn't probably even a hot drink, but there was resilience in every frost-edged breath. Because in the covered wagon, when the night howled and the drifts piled high, you didn't wait for the storm to pass. You learned to live inside it, together, one potato at a time. And as the snow deepened and the canvas groaned gently under its weight, something unexpected happened. The wagon rocked softly in the wind, like a cradle, like sleep calling to tired limbs wrapped in buffalo robes and yesterday's socks. But out on the trail, not every snowstorm ended with peacefully steamed potatoes and bedtime folk songs. Some shelters, like the Wagons, took on legendary lives of their own. By the time the first flakes began to fall in earnest, the travelers on the Oregon Trail had already developed a relationship with their covered wagons that bordered on the familial. The wagon was more than wood and canvas. It was a reluctant companion, a clattering mule cart with dreams of being a schooner, stubbornly attempting to navigate rivers, deserts, and now, most dreadfully, snow. As winter storms swept across the high plains and into the mountainous passages, The ingenuity of humans had to rise to the occasion. That is to say, they had to get real creative with their discomfort. Tent, too flimsy. Caves, not exactly everywhere. Nearby Sheraton Suites, tragically non-existent in 1847. So, naturally, people began looking at their covered wagons, the way you might look at a love seat, and try to imagine spending the night there, optimistically uncomfortable. Now, imagine a group huddled in a clearing. The wind sighs like a bored librarian. Snow thickens. Canvas snaps in the wind. Night falls like a curtain. And then one of the more sensible, read desperate travelers, points at the Conestoga with its canvas top and wooden ribs and says something like, "Well, it won't be worse than outside." And just like that, the prairie schooner became a prairie cabin. Snug as it looks from the outside, life inside a covered wagon during a snowstorm was not exactly the warm and fuzzy picture you might imagine. Let's not forget, these wagons were not insulated, unless you count being surrounded by barrels of flour and 5 children wedged between sacks of beans. Heat was primarily generated through collective despair, and occasionally a heated potato wrapped in a handkerchief. But timing was everything. Those who halted early enough before the snow could build earthworks, dig a fire pit, and position their wagons in a wind-blocking circle, forming a makeshift fortress, complete with the charming smell of livestock and smouldering buffalo dung. Those who didn't stop in time, well, their wagons didn't just become shelters, they became iceboxes. Refrigerated despair, if you will. This was why many started the journey with an almost obsessive attention to weather patterns. Travelers began to watch the sky the way a sailor watches the sea, nervously and with a tendency to mutter. Inside the shelter wagon, evenings took on an old-world rhythm. Someone might softly read from a well-worn Bible. Others might mend socks with stiff, nearly frozen fingers. They layered themselves in buffalo robes, beaver pelts, and anything that wasn't currently being gnawed on by the family ox. Children, known for their resilience and absolute refusal to sit still, had the disconcerting ability to fall asleep curled on top of barrels, snoring gently amid the scent of salted pork and canvas musk. Believe it or not, some began to see these unplanned snowbound evenings in the wagon as, well, calm. Not cozy, exactly, but the kind of restful, enforced stillness that settles over a group when they realize there's nowhere to go, nothing left to do, and miraculously, they're still together. No one lost to frostbite, no fires gone out. Just the faint sound of wind tickling the canvas and the quiet comfort of shared body heat. Some families even hung lanterns inside, their glow softening the harsh corners of the wooden slats. So there they sat, somewhere between discomfort and quiet awe. Outside, snowflakes fell with incredible patience. Inside, a hush settled, part reverence, part exhaustion. And for a moment, there was peace in the pause of the journey. There's something poetic, almost noble, about making shelter from what you already carry. The covered wagon, slow and stubborn by day, became a candle-lit sanctuary by night. It wasn't planned, maybe, but neither was the weather. And perhaps that's the true secret buried under those snowy nights. The pioneers didn't merely survive by adapting. They managed to stumble, half frozen, into some version of comfort despite it all. Of course, staying warm was just one part of the equation. Once the dawn came, a whole new problem unspooled like a particularly sarcastic ball of yarn. How exactly does one move a wagon buried under 4 feet of snow? But that, dear traveler, is a tale for another time. Somewhere near the western edge of the Great Plains, where the prairies begin to sigh and wrinkle into foothills, the wind started playing a familiar cold tune, shrill, theatrical, and just rude enough to make even the most seasoned ox give side-eye. Settlers who'd survived rivers, rattlesnakes, and months of salt pork suddenly found themselves at the mercy of an enemy you couldn't reason with. Winter. And my, did winter enjoy an ambush. It never sent a polite note ahead. No RSVP, no warning. Just one night, stars blinking above like curious onlookers, and then, without even a dramatic drum roll, snow. Sometimes a gentle dusting like powdered sugar on a prairie cake, but more often, a howling blizzard that rolled in like a gang of ghosts. And what were our noble pioneer families driving? Wooden boxes on wheels, wrapped in canvas like someone had tried to turn a picnic basket into a sailboat. Covered wagons or prairie schooners, as they were romantically called. Though let's be honest, if you squint, they resembled upturned bathtubs on spindly wheels more than ships. Still, they were miracles of frontier engineering. Light enough to be dragged for hundreds of miles, strong enough to rattle with your children, flour rations, and occasionally a stubborn goat, and, as it turns out, just barely snug enough to survive a snowstorm without turning into a people sickle. When snow began to fall and the air thickened like frozen molasses, there was no Hilton, no roadside tavern, not even a decent shed. Just you, your wagon, and whatever warmth you could wrestle from your own breath. So the pioneers improvised. The wagon, once a noble chariot of expansion, would undergo a humble transformation into a hibernation pod. They'd yank down the canvas flaps, tie them tight against the poles, and line any gaps with scraps of cloth, buffalo hides, or in desperate cases, avant-garde patchworks of petticoats and old bread sacks. The result was not exactly luxurious, but under those cramped, dim arches, families huddled like penguins, passing around tepid stew and the occasional potato with all due ceremony. In moments like this, fathers who once piped confidently about manifest destiny now clutched wool-wrapped infants while reciting unconvincing prayers to just get us through the night. Mothers, practical to the bone, could be found stuffing straw into corners to trap heat and whispering lullabies over the wheeze of the wind. And the children, well, the children didn't seem to mind. To them, it was like camping inside a giant bread roll, with siblings. You might think, logically, that the coldest danger came from outside the wagon. But the real trick was balancing cold against the peril of carbon monoxide. Fires couldn't be lit inside without courting catastrophe. So the pioneers relied instead on heated stones, gathered while the sun still tolerated them, tucked into tin pans or wrapped in old wool for warmth. This method extended bedtime by some 30 blessed minutes before the chill marched back in, like it paid rent. And nothing bonded a family quite like sleeping upright, noses to knees, skirts to socks, while Uncle Edwin wheezed through another snore that rivaled the growl of a disgruntled bear. Privacy, a fond dream, floating somewhere behind the lashed-up frying pans and pickled turnips. It's true, some families camped outside in tents like honest, glorious maniacs. But others, wiser or simply sleepier, made their wagons their home within a home. They pushed the limits of what could be considered cozy. They invented new tiers of snug, and they created an odd but beautiful seasonal tradition, the covered wagon slumber symphony. There is something both stubborn and poetic about a group of people wrapped in every promised slipper of civilization, choosing to brave a snow-filled wilderness with a glorified wooden cart, and then figuring out how to make it cuddle them back. And cuddle it did, if reluctantly. Even today, in the dry archives and whispery museum corridors, you'll find sketches and diary entries of such nights. Pages stained with frost and sentiment, reminding us that survival wasn't just a matter of flint and beans. It was a matter of togetherness, of ingenuity, and very, very warm socks. And out there, somewhere, the wind curled over a forgotten path, where a wheel once creaked and a lantern blinked kindly against the white. But as the snow piled higher and covered another track to nowhere, the wagons, those stubborn ships of the land, stood parked beneath stars, quietly becoming shelters of dreams. Soon, warmth will give way to movement, and those wagons will roll again, toward mountains, rivers, and something curious waiting around the next bend. The prairie winds shifted that night, with what some might call a divine sense of dramatic timing. One moment, the weary families were huddled near the crackling embers of their cooking fires, nibbling at hardtack, and perhaps daring, just daring, to dream of spring. The next moment, the sky performed a silent curtain drop. Snowflakes, at first playful and dainty, turned ruthless, enlisting reinforcements from every direction. The Great Plains had decided to become a snow globe, and everyone was trapped inside. It was December, though on the trail, time was more suggestion than certainty. The calendar might say the 13th, but to them, it was simply the day the wind howled through 3 layers of flannel and reminded you just how many fingers you had. As the storm thickened, choices dwindled. Inside the humble covered wagon, a marvel of 19th century minimalist architecture, families squeezed together like a bundle of mismatched socks in a too small drawer. The average covered wagon was only about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long inside. That meant if you, your spouse, 3 children, a skeptical mother-in-law, and a chicken named Deborah were trying to find shelter all at once, personal space became a fond memory. They didn't call it roughing it back then. It was just called Tuesday. But improvisation was a core competency of the westward traveler. When the blizzards rolled down from the mountains like grumpy old gods with frostbite, the wagon became something more than a vehicle. It became a cocoon, a place to suspend time, and, if only for a few freezing hours, hibernate like uncertain bears hoping for spring. Now, converting your wagon into a livable shelter was no simple task. First, you had to shove aside whatever overstuffed supplies you hadn't already eaten or burned. Barrels, sacks, extra boots, and possibly ungrateful teenagers, all shifted to carve out enough floor to unfurl a quilt. Then came the stove situation. Contrary to what logic and wishful thinking might suggest, most wagons didn't contain built-in heating systems. In fact, having an open flame inside your own wooden canvas-draped box was generally discouraged, for obvious reasons. But necessity, you might say foolish boldness, occasionally overruled caution. Pioneers would sometimes drag in small heating stoves, attempting to balance them carefully near the wagon's opening with a stovepipe poking through the canvas like an optimistic periscope. Did this occasionally lead to fires? Yes. Did it also lead to toasty toes wrapped in buffalo hide socks? Also yes. Calculated risks were the hallmark of the overland lifestyle. To insulate the wagon, travelers got creative. Canvas wasn't enough against a blizzard's frostbitten roar, so snow itself became the solution. With the same logic that brings us igloos, emigrants piled snow against the wagon's sides, using nature's own materials to dull its bite. Apparently, fighting snow with snow isn't just something you do with snowballs. Inside, the atmosphere switched from adventurous migration to forced family bonding. Quilts were layered like geological strata. Children were bundled until they resembled small heaving bundles of wool and cheeks. The air filled with the smell of damp socks, kerosene, and that one stew recipe everyone was tired of but kept eating because it was hot. And then there were the stories. This was when the prairie turned into a fireside parlor, and the wild unknown softened into something like home. Parents spoke of lands where grass grew high as a man's head and oranges came from trees instead of dreams. Grandmothers recited poems half remembered from boarding school, mingled with the gospel, and slightly confused folk tales about horses outsmarting telegraph poles. Somehow, wedged beneath canvas flaps and threat of hypothermia, they built a kind of peace. The wind rattled, the snow hissed through seams, but the people inside leaned on each other, not because they were sentimental, but because hypothermia didn't play favorites. Outside, oxen huddled together like squatting philosophers, silently pondering why humans insisted upon such nonsense. Inside, a child stirred in the misery of a shared bedroll, blinked sleepily into the dim, lantern-lit air, and whispered, "Will the sun come back?" The answer, always, but not tonight. Tonight was for survival and soup, for shared warmth and whispered dreams. Tonight, in the silence between gusts, history curled up gently in a wagon and waited. And while the prairie took its deep white breath, something else stirred quietly on the horizon, a new challenge, barreling down the trail like a drunken mule with a grudge and a timetable. But that's a story for the next stretch of the journey. In the deepening hush of a snow-choked prairie evening, with the wind curling like a sleepy cat around the seams of a canvas-covered wagon, something quite miraculous and fairly drafty was happening inside. Human beings, ever resourceful and ever cold, were fashioning tiny worlds of warmth in the bellies of wagons meant for motion, now stilled by frost. They became dwellings, nests, improvised snowbound sanctuaries that creaked with both old timber and old dreams. Covered wagons were never really meant to be homes, not permanently anyway. They were more like overachieving wheelbarrows, designed to haul dreams westward, along with a suspiciously large number of frying pans. Originally, most weren't even called Conestoga wagons, unless you really wanted to impress someone who knew Pennsylvania geography. Those were the fancy East Coast models with curved beds to keep cargo from sliding, not the disappointingly flat prairie schooners most settlers actually wrestled across the Great Plains. But once the snow began to fall, and then continue with the kind of persistence normally reserved for in-laws at Thanksgiving, plans changed. It wasn't just bad weather, it was a winter tantrum. So the humble wagon, already a beast of pack and burden, became a snug igloo on wheels. The transformation was a testament to necessity's talent for interior design. You'd start by lining the inside with whatever you had. Buffalo hides, spare shirts, questionable curtains taken from Great Aunt Hester's sewing basket. Anything that could block drafts or be fashioned into a crude curtain between the living quarters and the place you stored your emergency barrel of apples. Then came the choice to light a fire outside or risk a very stern, very smoky lesson in wagon ventilation. Most fires stayed outside for obvious reasons, namely oxygen and the structural flammability of wooden wagons. But some clever souls experimented with heating rocks near the campfire, then tucking them under the bedding, inside before sleep. A kind of 19th century hot water bottle, though significantly more geological. Inside, it was all about layers, not just in clothing, but in sleeping arrangements. Quilts, feather ticks, the occasional sleepy dog, and any relative who wouldn't elbow you during dreams of Kansas. people slept huddled like spoons in a drawer, knowing that warmth was less about luxury and more about proximity. The idea of personal space took a back seat to surviving the night without becoming a cautionary tale shared around someone else's fire. Outside, snow piled silently against wagon wheels like soft white barnacles on forgotten ships. The wind gave up protesting the canvas flaps after a few hours, sighing instead through the gaps like an underappreciated ghost. And inside those slumbering wagons, time stood still, hiccuping forward, only to mark the turning of a frostbitten hour or the dreamy murmur of a child asking if it was summer yet. There were advantages, however. Snow, for all its irritatingly dramatic entrances, is an excellent insulator. A heavy drift piled against the sides of the wagon could act like nature's own foam padding, quiet, cold, but strangely helpful. Some resourceful families even carved out snow trenches around their wagons to minimize wind contact, effectively creating miniature fortresses out of ice and wagon wheels. Food, of course, became peculiar. Salt pork turned noble, and dried apples achieved near celestial regard. Meals became ritualistic. Slow things warmed over embers, passed hand to hand, occasionally shared with the patient oxen tethered nearby, who had their own complaints about pallets of frozen hay. The nights were long, instrumentally long, and so people sang, told stories, and took turns watching over fire pits that flickered like fiery lullabies outside their cloth-covered forts. Someone might hum a broken fiddle tune while scraping ice off the lantern glass. Another might read from a frost-rhymed Bible, its pages crinkling with the dignity of overuse. And somehow, between candle shadows and creaking wood, between the snores of humans and the soft chewing of snow-dusted mules, these wheeled cabins became worlds of protection. They held fear at bay with laughter, kept death a door or two away with proximity and porridge. Tomorrow, with luck, or perhaps just audacity, the sun might appear through the murk. The ice might relent enough for movement, for one more crackling yawn of canvas and oxen. But for now, here, in the gentle hush of a prairie snowstorm, the wagons rest, and so do the dreamers inside. And just as our story sleeps gently beneath linen and snow, somewhere ahead, the firewood runs low, and another decision must be made. The wind howled like a lonely harmonica on the open prairie, and snowflakes settled over the wagon train like drowsy moths drawn to a flickering lamplight. Somewhere between Missouri and their dream of Oregon, the pioneers found themselves wrapped not in hopeful anticipation, but in layers of wool, buffalo hides, and whatever optimism they hadn't already burned for heat. It had started as a crisp morning in mid-November, the kind of day that smells like drying grass and saying things like, "We can make it through the pass before dark, can't we?" And yet, by midday, the weather had answered with a sharp absolutely not, and dropped a blizzard onto the unsuspecting convoy of covered wagons. The oxen were less than thrilled, pausing now and again to adopt facial expressions of bovine disbelief as the snow rose above their hocks. And so, with the cold hammering at every joint, the travelers did the most human and increasingly frozen thing they could. They turned their wagons into makeshift shelters. Within hours, entire families had retreated beneath their canvas roofs like determined turtles, ready to wait out the storm with little more than salt pork, soggy hardtack, and a surprisingly robust willingness to play fiddle music in dangerously confined spaces. Now, one might imagine a covered wagon like a small, charming wooden boat upon a sea of snow. But let's keep expectations appropriately grounded. These weren't exactly W hotel suites on wheels. The interior of a prairie schooner was only about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, just enough space for a family of 5 to curl into a human game of very cold Tetris. The canvas top strained under the burden of snow, creaking like an old man's back every time the wind exhaled through the pass. Candles were lit inside using the utmost caution, because nothing says cozy evening quite like accidentally burning down your only source of shelter in the middle of nowhere. A careful pioneer might hang a lantern from a wooden crossbeam or tuck a small candle into a niche carved from a potato. Yes, a potato. Potatoes. Nature's modest, fire-resistant candelabra. And then there were the blankets. Layers upon layers stitched, patched, and inherited. Quilts bearing the life stories of their makers, covering small children as they drifted off while listening to the snow drum against the canvas above. The air inside the wagon was stale with breath and boiled beans, but somehow it was better than the sharpening bite of the storm outside. Fathers told half-remembered stories of Revolutionary War heroes. Mothers humbly bragged about how Aunt Enid once made an entire meal out of turnips and grit. Children passed the time loudly not sleeping, asking questions like, "Are we going to be snowed in forever?" Or, "Is Grandpa technically allowed to snore that loud?" And through it all, the wagons stood quiet sentry beneath the gathering snow, their wheels slowly swallowed while their interiors warmed with the strange glow of human stubbornness and community. Of course, some wagons were more luxurious than others. One particularly smug family had insulated their entire interior with buffalo robes and sheer spite. Their neighbors huddled in jealously as they reported conditions indoors as warm enough to lose your third sock. When the storm finally lessened its grip, stepping back like a sigh of temporary respite, the pioneers emerged warily. The world had turned bright white, so dazzling under the winter sun that it briefly erased the roads, trees, and even regrets about leaving Ohio. Some had built snowmen to pass the time. One had given theirs a stovepipe hat and scowled, claiming it resembled Uncle Thaddeus, and warned passers-by not to make eye contact. But during those long, frosted nights, the covered wagon was more than a rumbling cart of dreams. It was a womb of tired courage, a place where the coal scratched at the seams but never quite got in, where people learned to sleep next to boots, biscuits, and Aunt Clara's loud opinions about beans. It became, in essence, a front-row seat to the show of survival, experienced in a boxy tent with wooden wheels and poor suspension. As twilight returned and the snow began to melt in streaks like spilled milk over the landscape, the wagons creaked awake. Wheels churned through slush, and the journey rolled onward, westward, onward, always onward, toward a future most of them couldn't name, but were desperately trying to find. In time, those who trudged ahead would pass stories down about the night the winds sang lullabies and the wagons cradled them like the arms of something solemn and stubbornly safe. And just over the next ridge, as the soggy land gave way to frost-glazed hills, something unexpected glittered, something that would test their ingenuity in ways that blankets and beans simply could not. If you've ever tried to make a snow fort as a child and realized halfway through that you are not, in fact, immune to cold, then you've already tapped into a canoe paddle-sized slice of the frontier experience in a snowstorm. Now, imagine instead of a half-hour snow day in your backyard, you're 1,000 miles into a prairie. You haven't seen a warm fireplace in weeks, and the only thing between you and a howling winter wind is a canvas-covered wooden wagon that creaks when you breathe too hard. As winter descended on the emigrant trails with the subtlety of a falling wardrobe, those covered wagons, oddly shaped and charming in art studio murals, morphed into makeshift alpine chalets, minus the fondue, plus frostbite. The wagons themselves, mind you, were nothing like the padded, cozy camper vans people retrofit today for rugged outdoor living. These were basically big wooden boxes on wheels, covered with waterproofed canvas that held up against precipitation the way a lace umbrella holds up against a falling barn. Your average Conestoga, or more commonly the smaller prairie schooner, was about 4 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet long, a snug fit for a family, a dog, and several 100 pounds of dried beans. But in snowstorms, real, hard, curtain-drawing winter storms, where the blizzard whispered to itself, yes, more drama, these wagons became survival pods. Settlers, travelers, even experienced trail guides all knew that when the snow hit, staying on the move meant courting the kind of frostbite one names children after in memory of. So instead, they hunkered down. First order of business, insulation. There's nothing quite like shivering under a thick buffalo robe, huddled next to your spouse who hasn't bathed since the Mississippi River, to teach you about survival. Families would gather all their cloth, blankets, coats, extra shirts, even flour sacks, and hang them carefully along the inside of the canvas to trap any semblance of warmth. In many cases, a small campfire would be attempted outside. Lighting a fire inside the wagon was politely discouraged by anyone who didn't want to roast alongside their salt pork. Instead, some particularly innovative travelers placed heated stones, warmed in the fire outside and deftly carried in with thick gloves beneath sleeping areas to radiate ambient heat. And by radiate, we mean cool off in about 7 minutes flat. But oh, what joy those 7 minutes were. Meals became whimsical affairs featuring ice-cold hardtack, lukewarm tea, the hue of indecision, and the odd squirrel stew if hunting had been possible before the snow trapped everything with legs. This was a time when raccoon tasted fine, really fine, especially if you hadn't eaten anything remotely juicy since July. But more touching than the strange menu was the sense of solidarity. Imagine 7 people pressed shoulder to shoulder under blankets, with frozen breath curling upward toward the frosted canvas above, telling stories to pass the time. Someone might recall a joke from the general store back in Independence. Another would softly hum a hymn or a fiddle tune, while a third tried to entertain restless children with a tale about a rabbit who outwitted a hawk. It was cold, unbearably so, but it was also, oddly, intimate. Diaries from the period tell us of entire wagon trains bonding over shared hardships. When one family nearly froze, another lent them coats. One man, John Hollister, recorded sleeping with his boots on for 3 straight days because they were the warmest thing he owned. When finally the storm cleared, he wrote, "I credit my toes to stubbornness and Elizabeth's refusal to let me die on the 2nd day. Now, from the cozy vantage point of your feathered pillow and the climate-controlled 21st century, those storm-trapped wagons might seem like primitive capsules of misery. But they were also tiny sanctuaries, small bubbles of laughter, of resilience, of hope steamed into the canvas, even as the snow piled 3 feet deep outside. And as dawn broke over snow-sculpted plains and the first soft light returned color to the world, families would peel back frost-crusted wagon flaps and emerge wrapped in layers like particularly sleepy onions, blinking toward the horizon, hungry, tired, but undeniably moving forward. And in our next breath, we'll wander deeper into what happened when the weather wasn't just inconvenient, but historic. By the winter of 1856, the road-weary travelers on the Oregon Trail had long since learned a hard rule of westward survival. When the wind starts whispering like a banshee and the snow seems to fall sideways, you don't argue. You dig in, literally or otherwise, and pray your wagon cover doesn't flap itself into oblivion. That December, near the Snake River, an unseasonably vicious blizzard rolled in with all the subtlety of a clap of thunder during a library story hour. The snow was thick and crunchy, like improperly milled flour. It piled quick, first on hats, then on shoulders, and eventually on the dreams of exactly on-schedule arrival. Families who just days before had been squabbling over who stole a squirrel's worth of bacon grease now huddled in silence, bundled in quilts that smelled faintly of lye soap and regret. The covered wagon, once a sunshade, a cargo hauler, a baby cradle, and occasionally a backdrop for dramatic marital disagreements, now took on its most noble task yet, survival pod. And if you're picturing elaborate, insulated compartments with warmed sleeping shelves, dial it back. What they had were wooden slats, soggy canvas, ingenuity, and the body heat of at least 4 people who hadn't bathed since Missouri. The canvas itself, typically treated with linseed oil and creative optimism, provided a decent windbreaker. Inside, cowhide blankets were layered like lasagna. Boots were removed and feet tucked against warm bellies. Yes, it was cozy. Yes, it was awkward. Yes, absolutely everybody pretended not to notice when Grandpa Lyman's feet started twitching mid-dream for the 3rd night in a row. To preserve heat, wagons were often parked in tight semicircles, wheel to wheel, draft animals corralled in the center to share what little warmth they possessed, and possibly to keep from wandering off in search of less frigid employment. Picture a sleepy snowbound hug composed entirely of oxen, mules, and exhausted optimism. Some families suspended pots of warming stones or coals inside the wagon, set atop carefully balanced cast iron pans, an arrangement described by one traveler as warmly hazardous. Child supervision became mandatory not out of affection, but because nobody wanted another foothole burnt through the floorboards. Meanwhile, food became more imaginative and slightly more despairing. Salt pork was prized, biscuits were near legendary, and the occasional snow soup, which was mostly snow with a hint of pepper, made an appearance. Soup recipes, by the way, were closely guarded under the pretense of having an actual ingredient beyond melted precipitation. At night time, stories filled the chill air. Harrowing tales of river crossings, of trading socks for beans, of a dog that chewed through 3 rains in Utah, but came around in Wyoming just in time to fight off a hangry raccoon. These tales were told by firelight, lantern glow, or, more often, the faint sizzle of someone's oil lamp running out 5 minutes too soon. And still, settlers sang. Not well, and not necessarily in tune, but in honest efforts to comfort both children and themselves. Sweet By and By drifted out into the snowflakes, along with much debate about whether or not it had a second verse, or if folks just hummed because they forgot the lyrics. Harmony was optional. Heart was not. Perhaps strangest of all was the almost fanatical affection for hot cornmeal mash. Once considered a dull breakfast, during these bone-deep winters, it became a comfort on par with having all your toes intact. One diarist noted, with genuine poetry, "It tastes of hearth and homeland, and of Marcy's elbow, which she used to stir it despite her broken wrist." Time blurred. Morning and evening became arbitrary ideas, but within their snow-draped wagons, people lived on, not just clinging to life but shaping it. Babies were born beside salt pork crates. Vows were renewed, sometimes silently. A few widows found new reasons to laugh when someone mistook soap flakes for oatmeal. On this kind of trail, absurdity was survival. And when the storm finally passed, it didn't so much end as get bored of bothering them. The clouds lifted like a half-hearted curtain, revealing the ragtag cluster of wagons, half buried in snowbanks, creaking stiffly back to life like ancient stagecoaches made of popsicle sticks and prayers. But no one was in a rush. Not yet. Because somewhere between the squished confines of canvas roofs and shared stew bowls, they'd found warmth that had less to do with fire and more to do with simply surviving together. Covered wagons transformed not just into shelters, but into homes of stubborn hope. And as the wind settled into a sleepy hush, a new sound stirred among the wagons, the destined, indecipherable muttering of a mule who'd just spotted something very odd flickering near the tree line ahead. As the snow curled itself quietly around the shoulders of the prairie, the covered wagons stood still like ships frozen in an ocean of silence. Somewhere between the last flickers of a campfire and the long hush of winter wind stroking the canvas flaps, a kind of frontier magic unfolded. Not the kind with wands and pointy hats, mind you, but the quieter magic of human ingenuity mixed with a healthy dose of survival panic. Now, the western frontier didn't come with a manual. No page saying, in case of blizzard, initiate Plan B. Turn your wagon into a cozy snow cottage. But necessity, as history insists, is the most reliable architect. To understand how families ended up nesting inside wagons during deadly snowstorms, let's revisit one deeply underrated piece of 19th century equipment, the woolen blanket, woven, thicker than a pioneer's sense of optimism and heavier than Aunt Martha's fruitcake. These blankets were draped over wagon interiors like tapestries hanging in makeshift palaces of weathered wood and iron-rimmed wheels. The sides of the wagon would be banked with snow, intentionally, because snow, oddly enough, is a better insulator than it is an encourager of travel plans. Inside, bedrolls were tightly packed. Children were strategically arranged like chubby, barely ripened root vegetables for warmth, and parents often layered so many garments they resembled frontier matryoshka dolls. The livestock usually got the raw end of the blizzard deal, bundled in their own animal way, often shielded under patchwork lean-tos made of scrap lumber, wagon canvas, and sheer existential crisis. Mealtimes, if you could call them that, took a dramatic seasonal turn. Biscuits once destined for golden greatness were now barely warm discs of dust. Any butter being little more than a frosty artifact. Beans became bricks that required a prayer and a pickaxe to penetrate. And coffee, if you were lucky, it was warm enough to remember it used to be liquid. Conversations curled slowly around the corners of these pop-up prairie igloos. They were mostly quiet affairs, punctuated by the occasional, "Did you hear that?" which always meant someone imagined a wolf, a ghost, or possibly just a very judgmental breeze. And yet, remarkably, many endured, not just because they were stubborn, though frankly, the pioneers could have taught the oxen a thing or two about digging in their heels, but because they turned their little wagons into wombs of warmth. Home wasn't a house. It was wherever the fire still crackled and someone could hum a shaky lullaby. Many children would later write about the curious comfort of those strange winter nights, bundled together like spoons in a drawer, with the sound of sleet tapping rhythmically on canvas above, and the blended smells of damp, wool, potato soup, and horse lingering like a pioneer potpourri. It was odd, but somehow safe, until someone had to go outside to pee, and then all bets were off. Let us not forget the unsung hero of these blizzards, lard. Used not just for cooking, but occasionally smeared on cheekbones and noses to combat frostbite. Lard served as both seasoning and skincare in a deeply confusing dual role. Multifunctional was the spirit of wagon life long before it became trendy to have a lamp that doubled as a Bluetooth speaker. From the vast, shivering plains to the tucked-in corners of a wagon warmed by breath and borrowed wool, these people carried on, not glamorously, not heroically in the storybook sense, but steadily. The wagon, once a mere vehicle of progress, became an unexpected cradle of survival, rocking gently in the wind, yawning under the weight of snow, and humming along with dreams whispered in the dark. Outside, the wind would moan its old frozen ballad, rearranging snowdrifts with artistic flair. Inside, a father might quietly stoke a tin stove, feeding it scraps of broken fence rail or a sacrificial chair leg, while a mother stitched a sock by lantern light, its glow throwing shadows that danced playfully among the frost-bitten beams. And even in temperatures that threatened to pickle the marrow in your pinky toe, the human heart had a strange way of finding warmth in proximity, be it from strangers turned family or from an old dog curled at your feet, radiating the kind of simple heat that money can't buy and lard can't replicate. The storms passed. They always eventually passed. But while the snow still held the world hostage, the covered wagon became a lesson in resilience and improvised comfort. A snowbound reminder that even in the hardest of times, one could still find safety, songs, and the smell of lukewarm beans with a hint of frozen optimism. But as another fragile dawn broke across the prairie, something stirred beyond the wagons, something that would shape not only survival, but the legends that followed. By the time the snow had begun to fall thick as biscuit flour across the high plains, the pioneers knew the difference between hope and foolishness. Hope kept them moving west. Foolishness told them they'd reach Oregon before the cows froze mid-moo. And so, when the sky turned grey and the air began to bite at exposed noses like a cranky old aunt with cold hands, the prairie travelers did the cleverest thing they could. They stopped, not in panic, but with that dignified resignation of folks who know when it's time to make peace with the elements. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the scuff of boots and the occasional horse sneeze, the covered wagon, that humble wooden turtle shell on wheels, became more than just transportation. It became a home. Not a cozy home, mind you. More of a stern auntie's guest room, with a bit of wind whistling through the planks and the comforting insulation properties of canvas. But history doesn't wait for luxury. It waits for grit beneath quilts and maybe a boiled potato or two. Inside those wagons, huddled beneath piles of wool and ingenuity, families laid out for the night like spooning sardines. Children clutched dolls with faces worn off, and parents whispered strategies, songs, or maybe just grumbled good-natured complaints. You see, in a well-packed emigrant wagon, you could fit 2 adults, 3 kids, a skillet, a bag of beans, and at least 1 harmonica player with a poor sense of timing. Smoke curled upward from campfires hastily dug into snowbanks as covered wagons formed makeshift forts, great wooden oysters hiding cold little pearls of determination. Outside, the wind groaned like a skeptical judge, but inside those wagons, steam rose off soup buckets and wet boots hung like hopeful fruit from rope-strung clotheslines. You could almost hear the sizzle of a story being told, half warming, half warning. Now some of the wagons sported canvas with a bit of beeswax rubbed in. A frontier waterproofing technique only rivaled in effectiveness by prayer and denial. Others wrapped buffalo hides over the top, dark and dripping with snowmelt like slow brewing tea bags. The clever ones even dug snow up around the wagon wheels to insulate the creaky floorboards. Nothing says engineering genius quite like freezing your knuckles to stack snow for warmth. Frontier logic, as always, was equal parts necessity and madness. Under the stars, not that anyone could see them through the choking sky, sleep came slowly. There were squeaks of wood expanding in the cold, the wind's long soprano wails on the canvas, and the soft lullabies of creaking axles. The language of wagons rocking gently as the frost settled in outside. Children with chapped cheeks drifted off first, their dreams full of spice cake and giant ham dinners. Or perhaps just a pair of dry socks. They imagined bears that served breakfast and snowflakes that turned into warm muffins on your tongue. Parents took turns sleeping and watching, some clutching shotguns not out of fear of bandits, but out of respect for the quiet. Silence on the trail was rare and best guarded. And while many slept curled together like loaves of bread in a basket, a few hardy souls would sneak out of their wagons in the dead of night to check horses, stretch cramped knees, or stare up into the swirling snow and mutter things like, "Good heavens, I miss chairs." It was these moments, hushed, half frozen, and strangely beautiful, that turned the covered wagon into more than a vehicle. It became a chrysalis of survival, an accidental architectural marvel of warmth by desperation, and a symbol of how humans, whether chasing a new life or just hoping their wagon won't tip, tend to turn whatever they've got into something that gets them through the night. And as the storm softened, and the wind wandered off to bother some other deserving patch of plains, the snow settled like a blanket over all those wheeled cocoons. Inside, breath-warmed canvas pulsed with the soft calm of winter sleep. Out there, on that cold expanse of nowhere, 100 wagons napped under the weight of weather, dreams, and more than a few unsaid hopes. So close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Imagine wool blankets tucked under your chin, the quiet hush of powdered snow overhead, and the gentle creak of wood cradling you through the frozen stillness. After all, history, like a good night's sleep, waits for no one. Safe and warm inside this drifting dream, let the cold stay outside. Good night, traveller.